The smell of burnt oil and cold metal hung over the airfield like a fog. Dawn had barely touched the horizon, yet the engines were already awake. 12 P-51 Mustangs idling in perfect formation, tails trembling under the rhythmic growl of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The sound rolled across the English countryside like thunder, muffled by mist and distance. Inside Hangar 3, the light was dim, a single bulb swinging from a cord. Sergeant Tom Hale, 26 years old, covered in grease and exhaustion, stood over an open engine cowling. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from another sleepless night. He watched a thin line of coolant trace its way down the side of the engine block, dripping in slow rhythm onto the concrete. The fluid hissed as it met a dark stain already there. The mark of too many nights like this one. He'd seen it before. The coolant leak, the sudden overheat, the engine seizure at altitude. He could still hear the pilot's last words over the radio, months ago, his voice cracking with static and disbelief. Temps redlined, pressure dropping, can't, then silence. They'd written it off as pilot error. Tom had written a report. Command had sent back a form letter. Now the same problem had returned. Same engine, same symptoms. And another set of boys was about to fly into German flak with a bomb group depending on them. 12 fighters to guard 32 bombers. Each one had to work perfectly. Each one. The air outside the hangar pulsed with sound, the rhythmic, angry vibration of machinery and war. The ground crews moved like ants, checking fuel lines, securing ammunition belts, shouting over the roar. Somewhere nearby, the radio blared a Glenn Miller tune that nobody really listened to. Someone laughed. Someone else coughed into a rag black with soot. Tom wiped his hands on his coveralls and looked at the coolant gauge again. He didn't need the instrument to tell him the truth. He knew that when those Merlins climbed to 20,000 feet, when the air thinned and the engine heat spiked, the coolant bypass valve would jam half open, a manufacturing flaw no one had yet dared to touch without official authorization. He looked toward the flight line. Lieutenant Collins, the squadron's golden boy, was already strapping into Red 3, the same aircraft Hale had been fighting with for weeks. The young pilot had a smile that didn't belong in a war. Tom hesitated, his mind warring with itself. Rules said he couldn't alter anything without written engineering approval. Experience said if he didn't act now, someone was going to die. He'd filed every report, followed every procedure. Nothing changed. Now he faced a choice, one that would define him. If he broke the rules and was caught, he'd be court-martialed. If he didn't, another Mustang might not come home. He reached into the toolbox and pulled out a length of copper tubing, scavenged from a damaged radiator last week, and a pair of wrenches. The cold metal felt heavy, almost defiant. "To hell with waiting," he muttered under his breath. Outside, the air boss signaled the lineup for takeoff. The engines began to roar, one after another, synchronized thunder rising in unison. The sound rattled the tools on the workbench. Tom's heart was pounding as he bent over the open cowling. He wasn't just fixing an engine anymore, he was crossing a line. He loosened the bypass housing bolts, hands moving fast and precise. The smell of antifreeze filled the air, sharp and metallic. He replaced the faulty valve line with his handmade copper pipe, adjusted the clamps, and sealed it with a mix of aviation gasket and stubborn faith. It wasn't regulation, but it would hold. He'd done it before, in the desert with jeeps and tanks that refused to cool under North African sun. Improvisation had kept men alive then. Maybe it would again. Footsteps echoed behind him. He froze. It was Sergeant Barnes, the crew chief. "Hale, what the hell are you doing?" "Fixing what engineering won't. You can't just start swapping parts. If I don't, Red 3 doesn't come back." Barnes stared at him for a long second, then looked out at the shimmering line of fighters ready to roll. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and finally said, "You've got 2 minutes." 2 minutes. Tom tightened the last bolt, wiped the sweat from his brow, and closed the cowling. His pulse was hammering in his ears. He could hear the countdown of the flight marshal outside. The hand signals, the rising RPMs, the crescendo of sound as 12 Mustangs began to taxi. He stepped back, his uniform streaked with oil and frost, and watched Red 3 roll past. Collins waved from the cockpit, casual, cheerful, unaware of the gamble sitting a few feet in front of him. The Mustang's silver skin flashed in the morning sun as it turned toward the runway. The roar built to a physical force, shaking the ground. The plane accelerated, lifted, and rose into the pale sky. Tom stood there until it became a dot in the distance. He didn't know if his fix would hold. He only knew that he'd done something no one had dared. And somewhere above the clouds, the test had already begun. If you like forgotten stories of American engineering and quiet courage, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It drummed softly on the corrugated roofs, trickling down the sandbag walls and pooling in the ruts between tents. Every morning began the same way. The sound of engines coughing to life, the bark of ground crews shouting over the wind, the whine of jeeps and fuel trucks crawling through the mud. This was the front line before the front, England's endless gray machine, feeding the war across the channel. Here, everything smelled of fuel, oil, and cold metal. Sergeant Tom Hale had been stationed at Boxted since spring. He'd arrived with the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneers, the first to bring the new P-51 Mustangs into European service. To most, the aircraft was a miracle. Fast, agile, long-ranged enough to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But to Hale, it was a living, breathing problem. A machine that needed constant care to survive the punishment of war. The men around him lived by rhythm. Briefings, checks, takeoffs, returns. Pilots slept little, ate when they could. Mechanics worked through the night under dim bulbs, tools clinking like wind chimes in the dark. The cold seeped into their bones. The noise never stopped. Even in sleep, the echo of engines filled their dreams. The airfield was a city of mud and motion. You could hear the bombers before you saw them. The deep, slow beat of B-17 flying fortresses returning from Germany, their bellies torn open, smoke trailing behind them. The Mustangs would come in after them, sleek silver shadows cutting through the gray sky. Sometimes there were 12, sometimes 9, sometimes only 5. Hale kept count. He'd started marking the hangar wall in pencil, a small line for every plane that failed to come back. After 6 months, there were too many lines to count. He stopped trying. On the 4th day of rain, Lieutenant Collins came back from a long-range escort mission. He climbed out of Red 3 pale and trembling. The engine was ticking irregularly, the smell of overheated coolant sharp in the air. Pressure spiked again, Collins said quietly, pulling off his gloves. Dropped halfway home, thought she was done for. Hale's jaw tightened. His modification, the copper bypass, had held for 2 missions, maybe 3. But now the same problem was returning. He climbed up onto the wing, pressed his ear to the cowling. He could hear the faint hiss of air escaping from the coolant manifold. The official manuals were clear. Do not alter the cooling system without engineering authorization. But those manuals had been written in offices thousands of miles away from the cold mud and dying men of Boxted. He wiped the rain from his face, stared at the leaking valve, and muttered, "You're not done yet, old girl. Not yet." Inside the hangar, the other mechanics worked in silence. The only light came from a row of bare bulbs strung across the rafters. Someone was fixing a cracked canopy with celluloid film. Another man was rewiring a radio that had shorted in the rain. A small stove burned in the corner, fed by scrap wood and oily rags. Hale sat on a wooden crate, rolling a cigarette he wouldn't smoke. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from fatigue. 48 hours without real rest. But he couldn't stop thinking about that copper pipe, the coolant pressure, the slow death of those engines at altitude. He remembered something his father had told him back in Illinois, long before the war. Machines don't fail because they're weak, son. They fail because men are afraid to change what's broken. Tom wasn't afraid anymore. That night, while most of the crews slept, he pulled the cowling off Red 3 again. The rain whispered on the roof, the air cold enough to bite through his gloves. He studied the coolant system, the same design used on hundreds of Mustangs across Europe. The bypass valve was meant to regulate pressure during altitude changes, but the internal spring weakened after hours of flight. Once it jammed half open, the coolant boiled, the temperature spiked, and the engine seized in minutes. He'd seen the wreckage in Normandy, planes buried nose first, engines fused solid. He began sketching on a sheet of scrap paper, a reroute system using twin copper lines and a pressure release vent. Crude, but functional. It would let excess steam escape without flooding the coolant lines. It wasn't elegant, but it might save an engine long enough to bring a man home. He stared at the drawing for a long moment, listening to the rain, then folded it carefully into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow he'd try it. The next morning, the rain finally broke. A pale sun rose over the airfield, painting everything in shades of gold and steel. The ground crews moved like ghosts through the mist, refueling, loading ammunition, preparing for another mission. Captain Morgan, the operations officer, strode across the flight line with a clipboard in hand. He spotted Hale under Red 3 and frowned. "Sergeant, those planes are flying in an hour. What are you doing under there?" "Routine maintenance, sir. Routine looks a lot like improvisation. Just making sure she flies clean, sir." Morgan eyed him for a moment, then nodded. "You've got one job, Hale. Keep them in the air. Don't get creative." As the officer walked away, Hale's heart thudded. He was going to get creative, because in less than an hour, 12 pilots would trust their lives to engines that weren't built to survive what the war was asking of them. He pulled his toolbox closer, rolled up his sleeves, and began to work. Bolts clinked softly in the morning light. Steam hissed as he released the pressure valve. The copper tubing gleamed like a promise. By the time the pilots reached the line for pre-flight checks, Hale was finishing the last connection. The modification looked almost factory-made, if you didn't know what to look for. Barnes, the crew chief, approached quietly. "You're at it again, aren't you?" "Yeah. You know they'll hang you if the brass finds out. Then let them hang me after Collins gets home." Barnes didn't argue. He just patted Hale's shoulder and walked away. Outside, the engines started to turn. The roar built, echoing across the countryside. The ground trembled. Hale watched Red 3 taxi out once more, the propeller slicing through the morning mist. Collins waved, smiling. Tom Hale didn't wave back. He just whispered, "Hold together, girl. Just hold together." The planes lifted, one by one, into the clean autumn sky. And for the first time in weeks, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. By late October, the days were getting shorter, and the cold crept in from the North Sea like a warning. The morning fog didn't lift until noon, and the damp never left the ground. Engines shivered before they started. Every launch felt like waking up a sleeping beast. In the 354th Fighter Group, men measured time by losses. The briefing board showed routes to Leipzig, Kassel, Hamburg, names that meant nothing to the mechanics, except as destinations from which some planes didn't return. Sergeant Tom Hale stood beside Red 3 as the flight crew gathered around. Lieutenant Collins had just come back from another mission. 20 bombers escorted, 2 lost, all 12 Mustangs returned. That was rare. The men were laughing, their boots squelching in the mud. "Good job, Collins," someone shouted. "Good job, Hale," another added, clapping the mechanic's shoulder. Hale forced a smile. He didn't like attention. He knew better than anyone that luck never lasted long. Later that night, when the hangar quieted down, he ran diagnostics on Red 3. The coolant system held steady, pressure smooth, temperature balanced. His modification was working, for now. But across the airfield he heard other engines misfiring, the same coughing, stalling sound he'd learned to dread. And by the end of the week, 2 Mustangs from the 355th Group failed to return from a bomber escort near Hanover. Both engines had seized mid-flight. Both pilots were gone. He walked to the wreck hangar the next morning. 2 burned-out Merlins lay on the floor, surrounded by silence. Their aluminum blocks were cracked open like skulls. The metal was blackened, coolant hoses melted into unrecognizable shapes. Hale knelt beside one of the engines and touched the edge of the damaged housing. His thumb came away gray with ash. The same valve, the same failure. He stood up slowly, jaw tight. The problem wasn't maintenance, it was design. The official reports called it thermal shock due to improper altitude management. Translation: the pilots were to blame. But Hale had seen the truth inside the machines. The Packard-built Merlin engines, the American-produced version of the British design, used a cheaper alloy for the bypass spring. It saved time in production, but under extreme stress the spring lost tension and jammed. Once that happened, the coolant couldn't circulate properly, and the engine overheated in seconds. He'd written 3 reports already. Each one had been marked "received" and filed away. He could almost see the pile of ignored papers sitting on some desk in Dayton, Ohio. He needed proof. That night, Hale stayed in the hangar long after curfew. He unbolted the bypass assembly from one of the failed engines and placed it under the work lamp. The thin steel coil inside was warped and pitted. He measured it with calipers, compared it to the British specification sheet pinned to the wall. The numbers didn't match. He cursed under his breath. This wasn't an accident. It was policy. The U.S. factories had substituted metal to meet production quotas. The brass knew. The engineers probably knew. But down here, where the consequences landed in the mud, no one was allowed to change a thing. Barnes, the crew chief, found him there at 2 in the morning, hunched over the dissected parts. "You haven't slept, have you?" "No time. Look at this." Hale handed him the spring. "See the distortion? That's heat fatigue. It's not the pilots. It's the damn alloy." "You sure?" "Dead sure." Barnes turned the spring in his hand, frowning. "Even if you're right, what can you do?" "I can replace it. Hand machine a new one. Copper braze the mount, reinforce the seal. It'll hold." "Without authorization?" "With or without." Barnes sighed. "You'll get court-martialed for that. Then at least I'll sleep knowing I didn't let another kid burn up at 20,000 feet. The next morning, Hale tried one last time to go through official channels. He went to Captain Morgan's office, carrying the broken valve in a rag. "Sir, we've got a systemic flaw in the coolant design. The bypass spring's too weak. I can fix it with—" Morgan cut him off. "You are not authorized to modify Army Air Force property." "Sir, this flaw is killing pilots. You're a mechanic, Sergeant, not an engineer. You want to save lives, keep the planes in spec. In spec is what's killing them." Morgan's expression hardened. "One more word like that and you'll be grounded. Permanently." Hale stood there for a moment, fists clenched. Then he placed the broken valve gently on the captain's desk. "With respect, sir, when one of those engines locks up again, I hope it's not Collins in the seat." He left without waiting for a response. That night, he walked the flight line in silence. The moonlight shimmered on the rows of Mustangs, their noses painted with names: Betty Lou, Texas Belle, Lucky 7. He touched each one as he passed, like checking for a pulse. Each of them carried the same hidden flaw, the same ticking clock. He stopped at Red 3 and ran his hand along the smooth metal of the cowling. The plane looked alive in the dim light, breathing softly as it cooled from the day's flight. He thought of Collins, the kid who still talked about going home, about opening a flying school after the war. Hale couldn't watch another one of them burn in the sky. The paperwork said no modifications. The war said otherwise. He went back into the hangar, locked the door behind him, and lit the lamp. The light fell on the workbench. The copper tubes, the springs, the tools laid out in perfect order. Somewhere outside, the siren wailed. Distant flak practice. Nothing to do with him. He rolled up his sleeves. "All right," he whispered. "Let's build something that lasts." The wrench clinked softly in his hand. The world beyond the hangar faded, replaced by the smell of oil, the hum of metal, and the steady rhythm of a man defying bureaucracy with nothing but his skill and his conscience. By morning, he would have something new, something that could change the war for those who flew it. And no one would ever know his name. The wind had teeth that night. It slipped under the hangar doors, carrying the scent of frost and distant sea salt. The sky outside was clear, the kind of bitter, endless black that made the stars look sharp enough to cut. Somewhere beyond the perimeter lights, engines coughed awake for a night patrol, then fell silent again. Inside Hangar 3, Sergeant Tom Hale was alone. The bulb above his workbench buzzed faintly, throwing a circle of pale light across the table. Everything beyond it was darkness, tools hanging like ghosts on the walls, the metallic glint of engines half repaired, the cold echo of an empty room. He laid out the parts carefully. A broken bypass spring from a seized Merlin engine, a salvaged copper manifold line, 2 hand-cut steel brackets, a section of flexible hose scavenged from a wrecked P-47. Each piece represented a rule broken, a regulation ignored. He wasn't supposed to be here after hours. He wasn't supposed to modify government equipment. He definitely wasn't supposed to be redesigning a critical engine system on his own. But somewhere above the channel, another crew was flying home in the dark, praying their coolant pressure didn't spike. He turned the spring in his hands. The cheap steel caught the light. Dull. Brittle. He tossed it aside and reached for a length of piano wire he'd stolen from the bass band's instrument crate earlier that day. It was thin but tempered, and he'd tested its tensile strength himself. It could withstand twice the heat the stock coil couldn't. He shaped the wire slowly, winding it around a steel rod clamped to the bench. Each rotation squeaked against the metal. The rhythm steadied his breathing. When he finished, he quenched it in a bucket of oil, the liquid hissing and popping. "There," he murmured. "That's not going to melt at 20,000 feet." He fitted the new spring into the bypass housing and soldered the copper vent tube along the top, leaving just enough clearance to bleed pressure without losing coolant. The smell of hot metal filled the air. It clung to his clothes, mixed with the faint sweetness of antifreeze and smoke. He worked for hours. His hands were numb from the cold, his eyes stung from the light. Every movement was deliberate, the careful balance of precision and desperation that defined wartime engineering. When the first light of dawn began to seep through the hangar slats, the new assembly sat on the bench, gleaming faintly. It was ugly, too many welds, too much improvisation, but solid, functional, real. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at it for a long time. Then he smiled. "You'll hold," he said quietly. "You've got to." At 6 a.m., the hangar filled with life again, jeeps rumbling, boots stomping, the chatter of pilots half awake and cold. Hale had already reinstalled the modified system into Red 3. By the time Lieutenant Collins arrived for pre-flight checks, the engine was purring softly, a low, confident hum that made Hale's chest swell. Collins leaned against the wing, sipping coffee. "You look like hell, Sergeant." "Didn't sleep," Hale replied. "Bad dreams?" "Something like that." Barnes, the crew chief, joined them, holding a clipboard. "Command's sending you boys deep today. Schweinfurt, Flak City." Collins whistled low. "That's a long ride." Hale felt his stomach tighten. The mission to Schweinfurt meant hours at high altitude, the exact conditions that had killed so many engines before. He crouched under the wing, pretending to check the fuel coupling, just to avoid Colin's eyes. If his modification failed now, the Mustang wouldn't glide. It would drop like a stone. Barnes knelt beside him. "You sure about this, Tom?" "No." "Then why do it?" "Because no one else will." The two men shared a look, one of those silent exchanges born from too many nights fixing death machines. Barnes gave a small nod. "Then let's make sure it flies straight." When the lineup call came, Hale stepped back from the plane, hands stuffed into his pockets. The roar of the Mustangs shook the ground as they taxied toward the runway. The sun was barely up, a pale disk fighting through the fog. Red 3 was third in line. Collins gave a casual thumbs up from the cockpit. Hale raised a hand but didn't wave. He watched as the plane accelerated, the propeller flashing in the morning light, and lifted cleanly into the air. The others followed, climbing fast, their silver bodies catching the sunrise like mirrors. Then the sky swallowed them whole. Hale stood motionless long after the sound had faded. Every nerve in his body buzzed with doubt. He knew the risk. If the engine failed, if Collins went down, they'd trace the modification right back to him. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. But if it worked. Hours passed. The airfield moved through its routine, maintenance checks, fuel deliveries, paperwork. Hale couldn't eat, couldn't sit still. Every few minutes he found himself staring east, toward the invisible war happening over Europe. By mid-afternoon, the first bomber formations began to return, limping, smoking, some missing wings or tails. The Mustangs would be behind them, as always. Then, faint at first, came the sound he'd been waiting for. The high, clean whine of Merlin engines in perfect sync. He ran outside just as the first fighters appeared, dark specks against the pale sky, growing larger, brighter. 12 Mustangs. All 12. They passed overhead in formation, sunlight flashing off their wings. Hale's throat tightened. He counted again to be sure. 12. When Red 3 taxied to a stop, Collins climbed out, grinning from ear to ear. He pulled off his gloves and shouted over the noise. "Ran her hot over Schweinfurt, Hale. Temps stayed solid, not a hiccup." Hale felt the breath leave his body. He laughed, the sound strange in his own ears, part relief, part disbelief. Barnes clapped him on the back. "Looks like your miracle worked." "Maybe," Hale said quietly. "Let's see if it wasn't just luck." That night, after the planes were serviced and the field went dark, Hale went back to his bench. The new bypass assembly gleamed under the lamp. He began writing down measurements, notes, sketches, everything needed to replicate the design. He didn't sign his name. He just wrote, "Field modification, successful under combat conditions." Then he folded the paper, sealed it in an oil-proof envelope, and left it in the crew chief's logbook. If command ever cared to ask, they'd find it there. If not, maybe another mechanic would. For the first time in months, Tom Hale slept. Not peacefully, but honestly. The sky was burning. Not the deep, clean blue of morning, but a boiling gray laced with tracer fire and smoke. B-17s lumbered east in perfect, tragic order, dropping silver flashes that blossomed into orange below. Flak bursts bloomed around them, black flowers in the air. Above the bomber stream, 12 P-51 Mustangs danced like hawks, weaving through the chaos. Their task was simple. Protect the fortresses, kill anything with a black cross before it killed the bombers. In Red 3, Lieutenant Collins gripped the stick tight, his gloved hands slick with sweat. The temperature outside was below freezing, but inside the cockpit it felt like a furnace. The Merlin engine roared a foot ahead of him, shaking the frame. The temperature gauge hovered just below the red line. He thought of Hale then, the quiet mechanic with oil under his nails and eyes that never slept. Hale had said, "If she gets hot, don't panic, she'll hold." So Collins didn't panic. Not yet. Red leader, Red 3, contact, 4 o'clock high. Copy, Red 3. Stay tight. 2 dark specks were diving from the sun. Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek, deadly, faster in a dive. The radio crackled with clipped shouts and static. Collins pulled the throttle forward, felt the Mustang surge. The G's pressed him into the seat. His breath came in short bursts through the oxygen mask. Machine guns barked. Tracers streaked past his canopy, white-hot and close. He rolled hard left, pulled into a climbing turn. The engine screamed. The coolant temperature climbed with it. 260, 270. He could almost smell the heat. For a moment, panic flared. This is it. She's going to seize. But then, the gauge steadied. The needle trembled and stopped. The new bypass was working. Hale's copper vent was bleeding pressure, holding the line. Collins smiled grimly and dove back into the fight. Down below, the airfield at Boxted was a different kind of war. Sergeant Tom Hale stood on the tarmac, watching the horizon through binoculars. The operations tent crackled with radio chatter. Bearings, call signs, numbers. No emotion, just data. But Hale heard every one of them. He could tell by tone alone when something was wrong. A mechanic ran up, mud flying from his boots. 2 birds missing from the 355th. 1 down near Koblenz. Hale didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the eastern sky. Barnes approached quietly. "You did good, Tom. Those boys came back yesterday in one piece. Maybe today, too." Hale lowered the binoculars. His face was pale, lined with exhaustion. One good day doesn't mean anything in this war. He turned away, but his heart was hammering. He didn't pray often, but he was praying now. For the copper line he'd soldered in secret, for the spring wound by hand from piano wire, for every gamble that had brought him to this point. Above the Rhine, the battle was chaos. Collins was locked in behind a 190, guns chattering, tracers ripping into the German's tail. The enemy pulled into a steep climb, trying to shake him, but the Mustang followed easily. The Merlin engine roared, heat surging again. 280 degrees now. The old valve would have jammed, coolant boiling out in seconds. Instead, the gauge dipped, 270, then 260, stable. The pressure relief hissed softly, invisible steam venting into the slipstream. "Come on, sweetheart," Collins muttered, eyes fixed on his target. "Show me what that mechanic of mine built you for." He squeezed the trigger. A short burst, and the Focke-Wulf exploded into fire. The debris flashed past his canopy. For a moment, everything was still. Just the roar of the engine, the endless, cold sky. Then came the radio. "Red leader to all flights. Bandits disengaging, bombers clear. Turn for home." Collins looked down at his gauges again. The Merlin was still running smooth. The copper vent Hale had built glowed faintly against the engine block. He laughed, a sound half relief, half disbelief. "Hale, you son of a gun, you did it." Back in Boxted, dusk was falling when the first Mustangs returned. The sound reached them before the planes appeared, the distant hum of 12 Merlins in perfect unison. The mechanics stopped what they were doing. Even the cooks came out from the mess tent. 12 silhouettes cut through the orange sky. All 12. When Red 3 touched down and taxied to the dispersal area, Hale was already there, standing by the chocks. Collins climbed out of the cockpit, pulled off his oxygen mask, and grinned through the grime. "She ran hot, Sergeant, real hot. But she never gave out." "Good," Hale said quietly. "That's what she's supposed to do." Collins looked at him curiously. "What did you do to her?" Hale shrugged. "Just fixed what someone else got wrong." Barnes joined them, holding a clipboard. "You know, Tom, word's spreading. The 355th's crew chief wants to see your notes. Says their engines are frying the same way ours used to." "I didn't write notes," Hale lied, though the folded paper sat hidden in his locker. "Then you'd better start." That night, the hangar lights stayed on long after curfew. Mechanics from 3 different squadrons came quietly, asking questions, passing around sketches, copying Hale's design onto scraps of paper and ration card backs. They called it the Boxted Fix. Unofficial, unapproved, but effective. No one mentioned Hale's name, not out of disrespect, but protection. If command found out, he'd be done. By midnight, the mod was already spreading, whispered between ground crews across southern England, drawn in grease on the backs of toolboxes. Within weeks, dozens of Mustangs flew with that same copper vent hidden under their cowlings. In December, an order arrived from headquarters. New field directive. Additional coolant venting approved for all Packard Merlin variants. Updated spring design to follow. No acknowledgement. No credit. Just another memo. Hale read it once, then crumpled the paper in his hand. He didn't need thanks. He just looked out across the line of gleaming aircraft, engines cooling in the twilight. He knew. Every pilot who came home that winter owed their life, in some small way, to a handful of midnight hours in a cold hangar, and to one mechanic who refused to look the other way. The war ended the way most wars do, not with fanfare, but with silence. No engines warming on the line, no scramble orders, no thunder over the channel. Just rain on tin roofs and men who didn't quite know what to do with peace. Boxted Airfield became a graveyard of machines. Mustangs lined up wingtip to wingtip, their paint sun-faded, their mission marks already flaking away. Crews packed up. Pilots went home. The noise that had filled every hour for years simply stopped. Sergeant Tom Hale stood in the hangar doorway, hands in his pockets, looking at Red 3 one last time. She'd flown 36 missions without a single engine failure. Collins had survived them all. The brass had transferred him to France a week earlier. Hale had stayed behind to close out maintenance logs and inventory. He was supposed to feel proud, to have been part of something big, something that won a war. But pride was a strange thing. It didn't fit easily in a man who'd spent his life fixing other people's mistakes. He ran a hand along the Mustang's nose. The metal was cool, the smell of oil still faint beneath the damp air. Inside, the modified valve still gleamed, the one thing in that entire hangar that wasn't standard issue. "You did good, girl," he said softly. "You did real good." He signed his final report. Aircraft serviceable, retired from combat use, and walked out without looking back. Illinois, 1947. Civilian life came slow. Hale took a job at a tractor plant outside Peoria. The machines were smaller, slower, quieter, but the work was the same. Fixing what was broken, making it hold. He never talked much about the war. When someone asked, he'd just say, "I was a mechanic," and leave it at that. He didn't mention Boxted or the nights he spent breaking rules to keep other men alive. The papers had never said his name, and by now even the men who knew him had scattered. Once, in the winter of '49, he got a letter from Collins, now flying freight runs in Alaska. "Still got the old instincts," the letter read. "Every time the temp gauge stays steady, I think of that copper line you built. Hope you're still building something that lasts." Tom smiled when he read it. Then he folded the letter, put it in a box with a few old photos and a wrench that had crossed the Atlantic twice. He never opened it again. Decades passed. By the late 1980s, Boxted was just a patchwork of farmland and crumbling concrete. The hangars were gone. The control tower stood half-collapsed, ivy crawling through the windows. A local historian named Mark Reynolds was cataloging what was left for a small aviation museum. He found rusted shell casings, a broken propeller hub, a few photographs donated by veterans' families. Then, In a damp file cabinet pulled from what had once been the operations office, he found a thin envelope marked simply, "Field modification. Successful under combat conditions." Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper. No signature. A rough sketch of a coolant system. A copper vent line. And one note scrawled in pencil at the bottom. "To keep them flying." Reynolds didn't know who had drawn it. There was no record, no report, no name that matched. But when he compared it to maintenance documents from other squadrons, he realized the same design, copied by hand, shared unofficially, had appeared on dozens of aircraft before the end of the war. A nameless mechanic's midnight fix had quietly become standard procedure. Peoria, Illinois, 1991. Tom Hale had passed away the year before, heart failure at 73. His small workshop behind the house was still full of tools, every wrench in its place. His daughter, packing his things, opened a box in the corner and found a folded piece of paper. It was a photo, faded, creased, of a P-51 sitting on a wet runway, written on the back in pencil. Boxted, 1944. She came home. She didn't understand what it meant. But somewhere in England, a historian was preparing an exhibit called "The Mechanics Who Won the Air War." Among the display items was an unsigned drawing, a piece of copper tubing, and a note that simply read, "Sometimes history is changed not by orders, but by the hands of those who couldn't stand to watch others die." Tom Hale's name never appeared in the official records of the 354th Fighter Group, but his work did. Every time a Merlin engine stayed cool when it should have failed, every time a pilot lived to see home. His courage wasn't loud. It wasn't in the headlines or the medals. It was in the quiet conviction of a man who knew right from wrong and acted anyway. And maybe that's how real history happens. Not with speeches or orders, but with hands that refuse to let go of what's broken until it's made right again. If you liked this story, a true tale of forgotten courage and American engineering spirit, support the channel with a like and a subscription. We preserve the memory of those the history books forgot.